What is up, everyone? It's another episode of the David Wells Experiment with your host, David Wells. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of a history lesson with Nintendo. Now, I've talked about video games before, and I've mentioned Nintendo because if you talk about video games, you got to mention Nintendo at some point. Other companies you can maybe not talk about, but certainly Nintendo isn't one of them. So, what a lot of people don't realize is that Nintendo has not just been around since the NES. They actually started in the late 1800s. And there's some lessons to learn from Nintendo, how they conduct themselves as a business and people that we can take some cues from and put into our daily life. You might think, okay, that's a little bit ridiculous, but once you hear their story, I think you might change your tune. So as I said before, Nintendo was started in the late 1800s, I believe 1893. It was roughly 30 years after the Meiji Revolution, which is when Japan ended its 200 years of isolation from the West and opened up. And they didn't just open up, they had a goal of becoming a modern Western society. And they did that at breakneck speed. In 1905, they went to war with Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and Russia had a head start on being a modern society, and Japan handedly beat them. A huge win for Japan and a humiliating defeat for Russia, but that's aside the point. So anyway, Nintendo starts off making playing cards, and they do this for a long time until their original founder, he retires in the late 1920s. He had been at it for a while and he decided, hey, I think it's time to pack it in, at least for him anyway. So to keep Nintendo a family business, according to laws at the time, his son-in-law took up his last name, Yamauchi. Now, this son-in-law, he decided to advance Nintendo and incorporate some tactics that had been used by, say, Henry Ford. He started like a factory and assembly line process for designing cards, and this helped Nintendo out a lot. But of course, war was around the corner, and everybody was affected. So fast forward to after the war, and they need a new successor. So what happened is this son-in-law's own son realized he didn't want to be in the business, so he left his family. So he had to raise his grandson, Hiroshi Yamauchi, to, he had to step in and be like a parent to him. So it's around the end of it's after World War II. This guy is on his deathbed. He says to his grandson, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who's, I believe, in his early 20s at the time and studying to become a lawyer, I believe. He's saying, like, hey, I need somebody to take over the family business. Now, Hiroshi Yamauchi has not had an easy life. Sure, he's the son of, or he's the grandson of the head of this company that's doing pretty good. But, he was abandoned by his father and left to be raised by his mother and grandparents. So he's got some stuff to work out. And he really wanted to make it on his own with studying law. But feeling a familial obligation, he decided to acquiesce to his grandfather. But he did have a stipulation. He said that no one else from the family can work there. And this meant that Hiroshi's cousin had to be fired. So Hiroshi Yamauchi, he's now the head of Nintendo. I believe it's somewhere between 1945 and 1949. I'd have to double check. Anyway, he takes over. He's young. He's in his 20s. And there are a lot of senior workers there who are like, who's this kid? Now, what Hiroshi Yamauchi does is he's an absolute gangster when it comes to exacting his vision. All the people who doubt him or who he think are going to cause trouble, they get the axe. And he makes it pretty clear who's in charge. So, one of his really great successes early on was he went to America and he saw how popular Disney was. And he struck a deal to be able to produce officially licensed Disney playing cards in Japan. That was the first big hit under his belt. And he even goes to America, which was, I believe, the playing card capital of the world at the time. And he visits the top card making company, and he has a revelation. Hiroshi Yamauchi realizes that it's a small business he's working in, and there's really not a whole lot of room for growth for him. So he's like, we got to change things up a bit. We've got to seek out other ventures. And that's what he does. So from, I believe it's the 1950s to the mid 1960s, Nintendo at Yamauchi's behest goes through a deeply exploratory phase, and they try a bunch of different things. One of them is a series of love hotels, which kind of seems at odds with future Nintendo's like family friendly image, but he was willing to try anything. Another was like instant rice meals, and the other was a taxi service. There were a bunch of others, but those were the most well known. Now, the taxi service was the most successful. Also, I think they might have even had a television station at some point. The taxi service showed the most promise, but there was a dispute with the unions, and Yamauchi did not want to acquiesce to them. So that was basically the end of that. So the funny thing is, Yamauchi, one day back in the 60s, he was just touring the factory, and he saw this one dude named Gunpei Yokoi. He had made this little extending boxing glove device just for his own amusement. Like, Gunpei Yokoi thought absolutely nothing of it, but Yamauchi was like, hey, there's something to this. And he said to him, hey, can you make a version of this that can be mass produced in factories? And Yokoi's like, yeah, I can do that. So finally, Yamauchi found the winning formula, and he realized Nintendo needs to go into the toy making business. And it was him and Gunpei Yokoi who created some of their early successes in that field. Now, as time goes on, they start to realize, hey, we can do stuff in the electronics. And that the 70s was when video games happened. One of their earliest tiptoeings into video games was Nintendo got the Japanese rights to distributing the Magnavox Odyssey. For those who don't know, the Magnavox Odyssey was the very first video game console. There is some debate as to what constitutes the very first video game, but the Magnavox Odyssey was the very first console put out for consumers. It's really hardly even a video game console. If you look at it, it's so primitive. The only reason to own one is for historical purposes. Basically, its claim to fame was it was the first time you could press a button and an object on screen would move. It had Pong, and then you could make a little square move anywhere on screen. They didn't even have, there was not even enough memory for an enemy AI. All the games were two-person, two-player games, and there was no room for background graphics. What you did for the games was you took a plastic see-through picture and placed it over the TV screen. That's how primitive things were. So anyway, they got the rights to that. And so I guess the whole purpose of the Magnavox Odyssey was to acquaint the general public with the concept of a video game of here's a system, here's a controller, you press the controller and stuff on the screen happens in correlation to it. So that's the purpose it served. And once that purpose was served, we had to move on from it. So anyway, um, Hiroshi Yamauchi, we're going to focus on him mostly through this. I'll name drop other people as I see fit. But anyway, Hiroshi Yamauchi realizes we ought to get into video games because it was a brand new market and it seemed to show some promise. And at the time, after the Magnavox Odyssey, basically everyone and their mom was making Pong knockoffs. And a lot of people got sued, but a lot of people also weren't affected by it. So anyway, you can only have so many Pong knockoffs before the market is saturated and people are like, man, I need something else. So it's around this time that video game companies, having seen the success of the Magnavox Odyssey, are like, let's come up with our own thing, but we can't just do another Pong knockoff. And so they start to develop their own systems. One system of note that isn't from Nintendo that we have to also mention is the Fairchild. The Fairchild was the first system to have a cartridge, even before the Atari. And yeah, so anyway, there's that. And it helped lay the groundwork for video games in the future. So one thing is, and I've got to look this up really quick because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this dude's name. Let's see. Sorry for the interruption, everyone. Let's see. Let's see. I'm only doing this because okie doke. So the reason to mention the fair, one person who gets like little love and acknowledgement for the Fairchild is Gerald Anderson Lawson. He designed that cartridge, the design which pretty much everybody has used since. And some people suspect the reason he doesn't get mentioned is because he's African American. So we're not going to make that mistake here on this podcast. And he's a name that ought to be known more in video games and the general public because we've all had childhoods that had moments with video games and we kind of owe that to him. Alrighty, so anyway, back to Nintendo. So Nintendo didn't jump on the console system just quite yet, but they did get into, they had various electronic games, and so that gave them, that weren't necessarily video games, but had to do with incorporating electronics. But they did get into the arcade business. And one of those arcades was Donkey Kong. And that was created by Shigeru Miyamoto. What happened was Nintendo had made all these video games, like for the arcade, that didn't do too well in the US. And so Yamauchi was like, hey, can you make something to replace all these cabinets? The plan was go to these cabinets that already had a game on them and reprogram them, which they wound up having to do for each and every single machine. There wasn't a way to mass do it at the time. The technology was so primitive. So anyway, this wound up becoming Donkey Kong. And one of the ways that Mario got his name was in their North American offices, the landlord came in demanding the rent. His name happened to be Mario. So even though Mario's initial name was like Jumpman or Video Man or something, down the line when he needed a more permanent name, they went with Mario as a way to kind of poke fun at their landlord. So anyway, Donkey Kong is at first it's just released in one bar in New York, and then it gradually expands as it becomes more popular, and before you know it, it's a phenomenon. It was ported to a console, but the NES, or the Famicom as it's known in Japan, wasn't the first console to get it as a home port. That would go to the ColecoVision, and it was a huge success for them, and it helped them stave off Atari's then dominance of the industry. So 1983 rolls around, and consoles are seen as the way to go. So Nintendo, a couple years prior, they decided we've got to launch a console. So in 1983, they release the Famicom, or the Family Computer, as it was known. This would later go on to become the NES in North America in 1985. So, it was a huge success, right? Well, there was actually a major defect in those early systems. So, there was a manufacturing glitch with the controllers for the Famicom. A button wouldn't be pressed, and there was even a short circuit that really hindered the performance of the system. Now, Yamauchi could have just easily just brushed it away and be like, who cares? But he felt indebted to his customers, and he made Nintendo to offer customers replacements for all their defective systems. One of the reasons this was such a big deal is because the Famicom, unlike its North American counterpart, the controllers were permanently a part of the system. Now, from a financial perspective, you might think, okay, he didn't have to take that hit. And some people thought customers and consumers would be like, oh my, their products are so defective. But it actually endeared them towards Nintendo because they were like, oh wow, they acknowledged a mistake and really went out of their way to rectify said mistake. So they had some strong fans as a result of that. Around that time, Sega also created their own system. And I believe it was called the SG-1000. It was sort of the precursor to the Sega Master System, or the Genesis in the US. But anyway, yeah. So Nintendo was the new kid on the block, and they dominated it. And a couple years later, they realized that the cartridge system, it's got its limitations. They need more room, more memory, all of that to make bigger games. So in Japan, they create a card system using floppy disks. If you don't know what a floppy disk is, then I'm old. But nothing that can't be fixed with a quick Google search. So anyway, this system is in Japan, and a lot of games are made for that system. But wouldn't you know, 2 years later, the cartridge system makes enough technological advances that the floppy disks they were using quickly became obsolete. So here in the US, we never got to deal with that because the peripheral to read the cards costed an extra $100. So, a battle we never had to fight. So, 19 so while the Famicom might have been super successful in Japan, it had a steep hill to climb in the US because at the time in 1983 everybody and their mom was making a video game system and games to play on it. And because of the oversaturation, it led to what was called the video game crash. Basically, nobody wanted to spend money on all these new systems and all these games, which really weren't all that great. And stores even started making space for other items that they thought were more profitable. And a lot of people thought, maybe video games were just a fad. And if it weren't for Nintendo, that might have been the case. So Nintendo enters the North American market, which does not want to have anything to do with video games. So they got to start by saying, like, hey, here's some stuff. You don't have to buy them. Just when you sell them, give us money. And they start doing this in New York and gradually expand. A similar strategy they used with Donkey Kong. And it proves to be successful. And it was a good thing that we waited until 1985 because, as I mentioned before, that's when they switched from cartridges to floppy disks. But one of the things they wanted to do was they wanted to make the ultimate game that could fit onto the cartridge that would push its limits. And that game was Super Mario Brothers. Now, if we'd gotten the NES in 1983, we wouldn't have gotten Super Mario Brothers right away. There were some interesting games, but Nintendo needed something like Super Mario Brothers to capture the American audience the way that they did. It was the only way they were going to be successful, and the wait was well worth it. So Nintendo takes off well in America. And yeah, so one of the things I failed to mention about Hiroshi Yamauchi is that one aspect of his life that was super difficult was the fact that he basically grew up during World War II. I mean, at the end of the war, as I mentioned, he was in his early 20s, but he went from being a part of a broken but affluent family to working in the factories, like to help the war effort. And at the end of the war, his side lost, so it had to really weigh on him. But I think it speaks to his character that he goes through a national tragedy like that and he decides, I'm going to become a lawyer. It could be very easy to wallow in self pity, but I'm going to persevere and push forward. And even more so, it speaks to his character when his grandpa asks him to put aside his own aspirations and dreams to help the family business. And he does so. And even more so to his character, he does know that, okay, I might have a familial obligation, but I got to make my voice heard. So I got to wonder how many of us would be better off in our lives if we could develop ourselves in such a way. Anyway, fast forward to the 80s. So the NES is doing well. The Famicom is doing well. And the 16-bit consoles are just around the corner. And they realize we can't rest on our laurels with the NES because while it was doing well in North America, competitors had come along. Hudson Soft and NEC had created the PC Engine in about 1987, I believe, and they actually overtook Nintendo as the top selling console in Japan. Sega had just come up with, I believe it was called the Master System or the Mega Drive in 1989. Sorry if I'm getting this wrong, it's really early in the morning. And they did okay, but they didn't do great in Japan anyway. A year later in 1990 when they released the Genesis in North America, they did brilliant in the US, but that's, further down the line. So anyway, Nintendo realizes they can't rest on their 8-bit laurels, so they begin the development of the Super Famicom or the Super NES in like 1988, I believe. So anyway, they do this and they wanted to release it in 1990. But Shigeru Miyamoto's like, hey, we need more time. Now, here's the key difference between Hiroshi Yamauchi and his counterpart for Sega, Hayao Nakayama. Hayao Nakayama would have probably said, no, we need it now, and rushed them to a specific date. Whereas Hiroshi Yamauchi knew, okay, if it genuinely needs more time to gestate and become the best possible version of it, then you can go ahead and have that time because I believe you and I trust your expertise. I mean, that's leadership right there. He could have rushed it and maybe they could have sold systems, but he was committed to the user experience. So he gave Miyamoto the time that he needed. So the Super Nintendo comes out, and the Sega Genesis already had a clear lead over it with Sonic the Hedgehog. But, Nintendo was able to hit back, and they did well in the US. They did much better in Japan. Like, Sega didn't really, it wasn't that popular over in Japan, and Sonic never took off in Japan the way he did in the US. So they didn't have anything to worry about there. But they did face some stiff competition in America, and they kind of had to relax some of their what some view as draconian third-party developer deals. So, and the only reason those deals began in the first place was because one of the reasons that led to the video game crash was you didn't have to have a licensing deal with any of the systems. You could just get the cartridges and make a game, and the market was flooded. Nintendo realized this, and they had really airtight deals with third parties like, hey, if you want to make games for our system, you need a contract. And here are the stipulations, here. And that was one of the things that led to their success was quality control. So anyway, it's the 90s, and Hiroshi Yamauchi, he meets a dude named Satoru Iwata who's working in this company called HAL Laboratory. And, they get to be pretty tight. And Hiroshi Yamauchi really believes in this, like, young kid. So anyway, the Nintendo 64 is coming out, and it's the beginning of the 3D era. So the Sony PlayStation had come out in 1994 in Japan. Funny thing about that, Nintendo and Sony were going to work on a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. And everything seemed to be going good, but then Yamauchi looked at the finer print and realized that PlayStation had that the deal benefited them way more than it benefited Nintendo and took away a lot of control from them. So they axed that deal. Sony, incensed, decides to release the PlayStation as its own system. And Sega, they released the Sega Saturn in 1994, around the same time. Or it might have been 95. Anyway, so Nintendo again, they release it a year after everybody else because Miyamoto was like, we need to make this good. And Yamauchi, again, he says, take your time. And the Nintendo 64 was a hit. In Japan, it was a bit overshadowed by Sega of all people. While the Saturn wasn't that popular in the US, it did astoundingly well in Japan and was their first hit in that country. One of the reasons being is they weren't totally sold on 3D graphics, so they made the Saturn a mixture of a 3D and 2D engine, and the 2D engine was phenomenal for the era. So anyway, they released that, and a couple years later, So the funny thing is, I've got to back up a little bit. So I mentioned Satoru Iwata. So anyway, Hiroshi Yamauchi thought very highly of Satoru Iwata, and his company HAL Laboratory. Well, it wasn't his, but he was a part of it. So anyway, when HAL Laboratory gets into some financial trouble, Yamauchi says, "We'll help you as long as you make Satoru Iwata the president of the company." And they do, and Iwata was able to bring HAL Lab out of the doldrums. And this impressed Yamauchi so much that in 1998, he asked him to come be a part of Nintendo. And so he had a real eye for talent, as demonstrated by, Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata. There are so many names I need to mention, but for the sake of brevity, I'm trying to keep it short. Anyway, so one of the things that Yamauchi did was he assigned Iwata to make the GameCube, which came out in about 2000, 2001, a hit. And Nintendo, they didn't really succeed with the GameCube the way they did. And so much so that, that when, Hiroshi Yamauchi called in Satoru Iwata to his office, Iwata thought he was being fired. But it wasn't that. Hiroshi Yamauchi had been working for decades at this point, and he thought, maybe it's my time to go. So in about 2003, he decided to step aside, and he named Satoru Iwata as the president of the company, and Iwata reluctantly accepted. I think he was maybe only 33 or 42. But anyway, the dude was young for taking on such an undertaking. But again, Yamauchi was 22 when he became the head of the company, and at the end of a war, no less. So one of the things that Yamauchi did before leaving Nintendo was, for the next handheld console, he made a comment saying, it should have two screens like the Game & Watch from back in the day. And they actually went ahead and did that with the Nintendo DS. So Yamauchi lived until about 2013. He passed away then, and he got to see Nintendo through its greatest days, and unfortunately, he got to see it through some of its darkest days. He got to see the success of the Nintendo Wii and how it vastly outsold the competition. And I bet his heart must have sang when he saw how well the Nintendo DS did and how people took to his suggestion of it having two screens. And he must have felt disappointed when the Wii U and the 3DS weren't doing that great. But I don't think he felt too lamentive. I think, given his experience going through tragedy and dealing with grief, he was like, you know what, this sucks right now, but we're going to get through it. I found a guy who's really talented and knows how to do things, so he's going to see it through. And although Satoru Iwata would tragically pass away 2 years later at the age of 55, he laid the groundwork for Nintendo's eventual rebound. Before he passed away, the DS was starting to sell better, and they'd begun work on the Switch, which, it's so far become Nintendo's best-selling system. So that just validates the convictions and the work ethic of Hiroshi Yamauchi. And I think one of the great lessons you can take is, believe in yourself and don't feel like you have to rush something. Certainly there are examples in video game history of people languishing and saying, give me a bit more time, just a second more. Sure, you need to get things done. But contrast that to Sega's Hayao Nakayama, who just tried to rush everything out as quick as possible for a quick buck. And you'll see that, Hiroshi Yamauchi truly lived his life. And yeah, I hope we could all aspire to something like that. This has been the David Wells Experiment. This subject matter probably isn't the last time. As my dad will tell you, I do have a bad habit of repeating myself. But hopefully we can have some fun doing so. I'll see you next time.